In the previous episode, we finished by exploring my grandfather's old farm. After renting our first equipment, we started earning our first money and created a field on the farm where we planted wheat. And now we continue working. Like and subscribe. Let's begin. In the previous episode, we ended with me planting my very first crop, wheat. Getting into my tractor, I headed to the machinery store to return the fertilizer spreader I no longer needed, and my first, although old, tractor. Instead, I rented an even larger fertilizer spreader that could also spread lime, because for my field to grow crops properly, it needed lime, and the field also required rolling. After carefully inspecting the equipment I rented, I loaded lime into the trailer and headed to my farm to spread it across the entire field. By evening, after arriving at the field, I turned on the spreader and started covering the planted field with what looked like a white layer of snow. After finishing the work, I left the trailer near the plow and walked across the field to check if I had done everything properly. After leaving the trailer, I headed back to the store for the roller. After attaching it, I tried unfolding it and did not expect it to be that huge. If I remember correctly, the store description said its working width was over 20 meters. After driving a few meters with this roller, I got out of the cab and checked what exactly it was doing and whether I had rented the right equipment. It was so large that I could barely drive properly across my uneven and oddly shaped field. It was a very interesting experience for me using equipment like this. After refueling a little, I started thinking that once the wheat began growing, weeds would appear and reduce the final harvest yield. So after comparing sprayers a little, I picked the simplest one because its spraying width would be more than enough. And of course, I also bought 2 tons of herbicide. Opening the contracts menu, I noticed several jobs for spraying herbicide. But before that, I headed to the farm first to spray herbicide there and get rid of weeds. But the fully loaded sprayer was so heavy that the tractor's front wheels were almost always slightly lifted off the ground because of the weight. After starting the spraying, I noticed in the field status that it had no effect, because at that moment, it simply wasn't needed yet. Because the time for completing the contracts I had seen earlier expired, they disappeared, and only one interesting contract remained: fertilizing. So after buying liquid fertilizer and filling the sprayer with it, I headed to the field near the machinery shop. Even though working at night was inconvenient, I still started the job. After finishing it, I accepted 2 more contracts, but this time for cultivating. I assigned them to a worker because I wanted to focus on something else instead of wasting time cultivating. And besides, I would still make a profit even after paying the worker. So while the worker was busy, I headed to the store and bought a chainsaw, then got into my pickup truck and drove back to the farm to cut down all the trees on the farm territory and any trees that could get in my way. And of course, sell the wood for money. After parking the truck to load all the logs onto it and transport them to the sawmill, I grabbed the chainsaw. First, I tried removing the small bushes that made the territory look abandoned, and then I started cutting down my first tree. One after another, cutting every branch and sawing the trunk into smaller pieces so they could fit conveniently into the trailer. I finished with the first tree. I strapped all the wood down with belts so I wouldn't lose it on the road and headed to the sawmill. Gradually, Tree after tree, I cut them down, divided them into several pieces, loaded them onto the trailer, ordered the worker to deliver them to the sawmill, and in the meantime, continued cutting more trees. Repeating these actions several times, I managed to remove all the unnecessary trees from the property and earned a pretty good amount of money. Each trailer load brought in around $5,000. During all this time while I was cutting trees, I had a worker handling cultivation contracts. After removing the largest trees from the farm territory, I thought that the barn was useless because there was no real way to use it. Instead, I could place an animal pen or a machinery shelter there. So I sold the barn, which was taking up a lot of space, and additionally earned a small amount of money from selling it. But there was still one tree left, which I also cut down and sold at the sawmill. After that, I thought that I needed to completely clear the territory and increase the available space to place machinery or other important things there. So I made the decision to completely remove all the buildings and fences from the farm territory. But removing large rocks and tree stumps isn't easy at all. Special equipment is needed for that. Because of them, nothing can really be placed on that land. So later, I want to deal with that problem too. Until now, the tractor had constantly been working on contracts, but now there were no contracts available, so I brought it back to the farm and left it there. It was also necessary to replace the dirt paths with asphalt, because every time I drove to the field, the uneven terrain created by heavy machinery made driving difficult. There was also one more tree that bothered me whenever I drove into the farm territory. It stood right on the corner, and it would have been very easy to hit it with a trailer or some equipment. So I cut it down and ordered the worker to deliver it to the sawmill for sale. At that point, I decided to stop cutting trees because it was taking way too much time. Winter had already arrived, and there were fewer and fewer field jobs available. But in the contracts menu, I noticed an interesting task about destroying rocks, which was exactly what I needed, because I could practice on the contract first, and later remove the rocks on my own territory. I took all the required equipment, including this loader, and after attaching a rock crusher drill to it, and spending some time figuring out the controls, I headed to the contract. The task required going to another person's property and destroying all the rocks there. But the loader turned out to be very slow and could only drive at 18 kilometers per hour, so I assigned the worker to drive it to the destination while I delivered the remaining wood I had recently cut. When the worker finished and arrived, I got into the loader, drove up to the required rock, inspected everything, lowered the drill, and turned it on. After just a few seconds, the massive rock completely shattered as if it had never existed. But because it was my first time doing this, I accidentally destroyed a rock that wasn't supposed to be touched, but thankfully, nothing terrible happened. After constantly driving between the farm and the sawmill, my truck became extremely dirty, so I drove to the machinery store, rented a washing machine for vehicles, and cleaned it until it shined. After finishing everything, I started thinking about buying my own loader instead of constantly renting equipment like before. And I actually had enough money from selling the wood. But the loader alone wouldn't be enough. I also needed tools for it. First, I chose a high-tip bucket so I could load grain and other bulk materials. I also needed pallet forks to move pallets with fertilizer, pesticides, or seeds. And of course, I rented a drill and a stump grinder. Especially the stump grinder looked incredibly powerful, and I was already excited to test it. To remove rocks and stumps from the territory without constantly driving back for every tool, I loaded them onto the pickup trailer, almost all except for the bucket, and drove to the farm while the worker followed behind me in the loader carrying the bucket. Arriving at the farm while waiting for the loader, I started unloading every tool and arranging them for easier use. After the loader finally arrived, the first thing I did was attach the drill, and it worked perfectly. In the contracts menu, I noticed a task about collecting rocks, and I became curious about how exactly it worked, so I accepted the contract with all the required equipment, which included a tractor, a rock collector, and a trailer to unload the stones into. After watching how it worked for a little while, I assigned the job to a worker and continued destroying rocks. After breaking the rocks, only small piles of pebbles remained, which could easily be covered with asphalt. I was done with the rocks, but the stumps still remained. Driving up to one of them, I tried grinding it down. Everything seemed correct, but because of some bug, it didn't completely disappear. Only part of it got removed. Later, I'll have to figure out a solution, because I would like to place something there. After trying many different methods to grind it down, I eventually gave up on that stump and tested the grinder on smaller ones. Unlike the previous stump, everything worked perfectly, and I managed to remove the smaller stumps. There was even one large stump that I somehow managed to remove successfully. The very first thing I decided to build was a pig enclosure for 36 pigs. But simply placing it wasn't enough. I also needed to buy some pigs. After buying 5 piglets, they would eventually grow up over time. Later, I'll need to bring them food and water using the loader. But for today, I think that's enough. Later, we will continue developing our farm, raising the piglets, earning more money, and hopefully buying our very first combine harvester, so we can harvest large fields. But for today, that's all. Like, subscribe. See you soon.